Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in United States history. Before we start, I invite you to leave a comment saying where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. We're curious to know what places and what times of day or night these documented accounts managed to reach. The year was 1852. When the first reports of strange echoes began appearing in the marshlands west of Charleston County, South Carolina. Local hunters would come back from trips with stories of voices calling out together, always at dusk. Always in that same haunting rhythm that seemed to rise up from the brackish water. They would say the voices sounded like children, but with a hollowness that made their skin crawl. For years, these tales were dismissed as products of isolation and exhaustion. Stories spun by men who had spent too many days alone in the unforgiving wilderness. If you're enjoying the story and feel like helping the channel with any amount, please support us by hitting the thanks button and donating whatever you wish. This truly helps the channel continue posting new stories. That changed when a land surveyor named Thomas Blackwood found what looked like makeshift shelters built among the cypress knees, deep inside the Congaree swamp. According to county records from April 12, 1854, Blackwood reported discovering crude but clever structures made of mud, reeds, and Spanish moss, small enough to fit only children or people of diminutive stature. What troubled authorities wasn't just the find itself, but Blackwood's insistence that the structures had been recently lived in. The Tillman Plantation, one of the biggest in the region, stretched over 800 acres along the swamp's edge. Census records from 1850 show Jacob Tillman owned 73 enslaved people, including a pair of twins born in 1837. According to the plantation's ledger, uncovered during a courthouse renovation in 1961. These twins were simply listed as male property matching, acquired from Savannah auction, cost $400 for the pair. No names were recorded. What makes this case especially disturbing is the level of documentation that survived, alongside the systematic erasure of identity that was standard practice across southern plantations. On paper, these twins existed only as property, their humanity reduced to a financial transaction. Yet their presence would eventually cast a long shadow over the entire Tillman bloodline. By all accounts, Jacob Tillman ran his plantation with ruthless efficiency. Local papers from the time describe him as a man of considerable standing and exemplary Christian values, though those characterizations came exclusively from publications known to defend slavery. A different picture emerges from the journal of Eliza Montgomery, wife of a neighboring plantation owner, who wrote in her private correspondence. The methods used on the Tillman property are spoken of in hushed tones, even among those accustomed to the necessities of keeping order. There are sounds that carry across the fields at night that I dare not describe, even in this private account. According to work assignment logs, the twins worked in the cotton fields from age 6. What set them apart, based on overseer records, was their eerie ability to communicate without speaking, a trait that deeply unsettled the overseer, a man named Richard Barrett. In his quarterly report to Tillman from the summer of 1848, Barrett wrote, "The matched boys continue to perform adequately, though their silent communications cause discomfort among the other hands. When separated, their work suffers considerably. I recommend keeping them assigned to the same field, despite my personal reservations about their influence." The Congaree Swamp, which bordered the western edge of the Tillman Plantation, was considered impassable by most. A labyrinth of waterways, quicksand, and thick vegetation stretching for miles. Local indigenous knowledge held that there were hidden paths through the swamp, but this information was closely guarded. What we know from archaeological studies in the 1950s is that seasonal paths did exist, navigable only by those with intimate knowledge of the landscape. On the night of July 26, 1850, during a violent thunderstorm that local newspapers described as a deluge of biblical proportions, something happened on the Tillman Plantation that was never officially recorded. According to kitchen house gossip, noted down years later by a former cook interviewed by a folklore collector from Charleston in 1878, the twins had been caught trying to teach younger children to read, an offense that usually brought severe punishment. What followed has been pieced together from fragments. An entry in the plantation punishment log simply notes, discipline administered to matching male property for seditious activities. The medical agent by the local doctor, who served 3 plantations in the area, recorded a visit to the Tillman property the next day, but contains only the cryptic note, advised against further application of salt to open tissues. Patient unlikely to survive regardless. That night, during the peak of the storm, the twins vanished. The official story, as recorded in a notice placed in the Charleston Mercury on August 2, 1850, described them as runaways, dangerous and likely injured, with a $50 reward offered for their return. What's striking about this notice is that it marked the first time the twins were given names in any official document. Solomon and Samuel. Whether these were names they had chosen for themselves or labels assigned by the Tillman family remains unknown. The standard procedure for tracking escaped enslaved people involved dogs and hired slave catchers who knew the surrounding territories. According to Tillman Plantation expense records, 3 separate tracking parties were organized during August 1850. The first 2 came back empty-handed. The third did not return at all. The disappearance of that third party, led by an experienced slave catcher named Jeremiah Holt and 2 of his associates, led to a larger search group, including men from neighboring plantations. This escalation reflected not just the loss of property, but a growing unease about what exactly was happening in the swamp. According to a letter Jacob Tillman sent to the county sheriff on September 10, 1850, the situation has grown beyond the matter of 2 escaped males and now involves the disappearance of 3 white men of good standing. I request official intervention, as this matter now concerns public safety rather than merely private property. The official search party, 12 armed men, ventured into the swamp on September 15th. They returned 3 days later with a strange account documented in the sheriff's report, now preserved in the South Carolina State Archives. According to Sheriff William Holcomb, the expedition found evidence of human habitation deep within the swampland, in areas previously thought uninhabitable. Structures made from natural materials were discovered, along with what seemed to be a system of raised pathways built across the boggy ground. Most disturbing was the discovery of items belonging to Mr. Holt and his associates, arranged in what could only be described as a deliberate display. The items included their weapons, boots, and personal effects, yet no trace of the men themselves was found. The dogs became unusually agitated in this area and refused to go further. What happened next set off a chain of events that would eventually give rise to the legend of the Cottonfield ghosts. Jacob Tillman, increasingly obsessed with the twins' escape and the subsequent disappearances, organized his own expedition into the swamp, bringing his oldest son, Jacob Jr., and 4 of his most trusted hands. They left on October 3, 1850, with supplies for a week-long search. Only Jacob Jr. returned, emerging from the swamp on October 10th, alone and in a state the family physician described as acute nervous exhaustion. He was found by a fishing party along the swamp's eastern edge, his clothes torn and body covered in mud. according to the doctor's notes. The young man was unable or unwilling to give a coherent account of the expedition's fate. He would say only that his father and the others had been claimed by the swamp. For 3 months after his return, Jacob Jeter stayed largely confined to his room in the family house, refusing visitors and speaking only to his mother and the house servants. During this period, according to household staff accounts collected years later, he insisted the windows remain shuttered at all times and would become severely agitated at the sound of distant voices, especially around dusk. In January 1851, Jacob Jeter finally provided a written statement to local authorities about the fate of his father and the others. This document, preserved in county records, is remarkable for its clinical detachment. The search party separated on the 4th day to cover more ground. I remained with my father and one other man. We heard what sounded like a child calling for help and followed the voice deeper into the swamp. The terrain became increasingly difficult to navigate. At some point, I became separated from the others. Despite my calls, I received no response. After attempting to locate them for several hours, I was forced to make my way out alone, which took approximately 3 days due to disorientation. What makes this account particularly suspect is that it contradicts statements made by house servants who claim to have overheard Jacob Jeter during what appeared to be nightmares in the weeks after his return. According to those accounts, he would cry out about eyes watching from the water and voices that speak without sound. Most disturbing was his repeated reference to the twins, standing together like one person. By spring 1851, the Tillman plantation had fallen into noticeable decline. With Jacob's sister presumed dead, ownership passed to his son, who showed little interest in managing the property. Neighbors reported untended fields and lax discipline. According to local gossip recorded in various personal diaries from the period, the younger Tillman spent more and more time drinking and was often seen at the edge of the property staring into the swamp. In June of that year, a series of unusual events began that would cement the twins' legend in local folklore. Workers in the fields farthest from the main house started reporting sightings of 2 identical figures, watching from the tree line at the swamp's edge. These sightings always occurred at dusk and always on days when Jacob Jeter was away from the property. According to testimonies collected by a journalist from the Charleston Courier, who visited the plantation in July 1851, at least 7 different workers claimed to have seen 2 young men standing perfectly still and perfectly identical, wearing clothes made from swamp materials, their eyes reflecting light like those of swamp creatures. The journalist, a man named Edward Peyton, initially approached these accounts with skepticism, attributing them to superstition and the general atmosphere of unease that had settled over the plantation. However, in his published article, which appeared on July 28, 1851, Peyton wrote, "While this correspondent maintains a rational explanation exists for the phenomena reported on the Tillman property, I must in good conscience report that during my evening interview with the current Mr. Tillman, I myself observed what appeared to be 2 silhouettes at the edge of the swamp. When I directed my host's attention to that sight, he became immediately distressed and ordered the shutters closed and additional lamps lit, refusing to speak further on the matter." By fall 1851, the Tillman plantation had become a place of whispered rumors and growing fear. Workers began requesting transfers to other properties, something almost unheard of in the rigid plantation system. More troubling were the disappearances. 3 field hands vanished over 2 months. In each case, the person had been assigned to work in the westernmost fields next to the swamp. In each case, they were last seen as dusk approached. Jacob Tillman Jr.'s response to these disappearances was documented in a letter to the county sheriff dated November 12, 1851. I request that no official search be conducted for the missing property. The swamp has claimed them as it has claimed others. Further intrusion will only result in additional losses. This fatalistic attitude, combined with his increasingly erratic behavior, contributed to a sense that the Tillman plantation was somehow cursed. By December, production had fallen so significantly that creditors began expressing concern. According to bank records from Charleston, loans taken out against future harvests went unpaid, and by early 1852, the bank was considering foreclosure. The situation came to a head on the night of February 15, 1852. According to accounts from the house servants, Jacob Jr. spent that evening in his study, drinking heavily and writing what would later be described as a confession. Around midnight, he ordered a horse saddled and rode toward the swamp, carrying only a lantern and the papers he had been writing. He told the stable hand not to expect his return. The confession, found the next day on his desk, has been preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society archives. Parts of it were damaged by what appears to be water or some other liquid, but the legible portions offer a disturbing glimpse into the events of the previous year. What we did to those boys over the years was beyond the common cruelties of our institution. My father took a particular interest in breaking what he called their unnatural bond. They were separated, starved, subjected to trials that I cannot commit to paper even now. The night they escaped, they had been hay eligible and were not expected to survive until morning. The document goes on to describe the expedition into the swamp. We found their settlement on the 6th day. It was unlike anything I had seen. Structures built above the water on stilts connected by pathways visible only to those who knew where to look. The twins had created something impossible. They were not alone. We counted at least 12 others, all previously from our property, all reported as runaways or presumed dead. They had built a community in a place we thought uninhabitable. The most disturbing passage comes near the end. When they took my father, he was still alive. The twins approached him together, moving as one person, their expressions identical. They did not speak. They never spoke. But somehow everyone knew what was to be done. I was spared only to deliver a message, though no words were ever spoken. The message was clear. The swamp is now their plantation, and we are not welcome. The final paragraph reads, I return to them tonight of my own accord. The watching has become unbearable. They stand at the edge of the property every evening now, visible only to me. Their eyes reflect the light like those of swamp creatures. They are waiting for me to join my father. Jacob Tillman Jr. was never seen again. Afterward, the Tillman plantation was sold at auction to cover outstanding debts. The new owner, a man named Harrison Miller from Virginia, arrived in April 1852 with ambitious plans to restore the property to productivity. According to his business correspondence preserved by his descendants and donated to the University of South Carolina in 1958, Miller knew about the property's troubled history, but dismissed the stories as superstitious nonsense spread by lazy and ignorant workers. Miller's first action was to drain part of the swampland to expand cultivatable acreage. Work began in May 1852 and immediately ran into problems. Equipment broke down frequently. Workers reported unusual illnesses. And on 3 separate occasions, drainage ditches dug during the day were found filled in the next morning. By June, Miller's correspondence had taken on a different tone. There is something unusual about this place, particularly regarding the swampland. The locals refuse to work near it, especially in the late afternoon hours. I've had to bring in workers from elsewhere at considerable expense, and even they grow reluctant after a few days. Last week, our surveyor reported seeing two identical young men watching from the tree line. When approached, they reportedly retreated into the water and disappeared. The surveyor resigned that same day. In July 1852, Miller made what would prove to be a fatal decision. Frustrated by the ongoing resistance to developing the swampland, he organized a large-scale expedition to locate and destroy what he called the hidden settlement that harbors fugitives and fosters superstition. 20 armed men ventured into the swamp on July 20th. They carried enough supplies for a week and were under orders to methodically search every possible location where people might be living. Only 3 returned, emerging separately over 3 days. Each told a similar story. The group had become separated in the swamp despite their best efforts to stay together. They reported hearing their companions calling for help, only to find no one when they reached the apparent source of the cries. The most disturbing account came from Miller's foreman, who claimed to have glimpsed what he described as a thriving village built on stilts above the water, inhabited by at least 30 souls, with 2 identical young men appearing to direct the others without speaking a word. Harrison Miller himself was among those who never returned. His body was found 3 weeks later at the edge of the property, half submerged in a drainage ditch that had been dug under his orders. The county coroner listed the cause of death as drowning, though he noted that the body showed unusual signs of prolonged immersion despite being found in shallow water. With Miller's death, the property once again changed hands. This time, however, no single buyer could be found willing to take on what was now openly referred to as the haunted plantation. The land was divided and sold in parcels, with the portion bordering the swamp remaining unclaimed and eventually reverting to the state. Throughout the remainder of the 1850s, the legend of the twins grew across the region. They became known as the Cottonfield Ghosts, a name that persisted despite the fact that all accounts described them as living, breathing people. What made them ghost-like in the public imagination was their ability to appear and disappear, their identical nature, and the impossibility of their survival in an environment considered uninhabitable. Reported sightings continued for years, always following the same pattern. 2 identical young men observed at dusk, standing perfectly still at the boundary between cultivated land and wilderness. Those who claimed to have seen them up close described their eyes as reflecting light like alligators, and their skin as having taken on the very texture of the swamp. In 1856, a professor of natural history from the College of Charleston, named James Whittaker, became interested in the case. Skeptical of the supernatural elements, but intrigued by the possibility that a community of escaped enslaved people had indeed established a settlement in the swamp, Whittaker began collecting testimonies and examining public records related to the Tillman Plantation. His research, published in 1858 as An Investigation of Reported Phenomena in the Congaree Swamp, represents one of the first attempts at a scientific explanation for the events. Whittaker proposed that the twins had indeed escaped into the swamp and, possessing unusual intelligence and perhaps knowledge gained from local indigenous people, had managed to create a sustainable, living situation in that hostile environment. He suggested that their reported ability to communicate without speaking was likely a form of sign language developed during their years in captivity, when silence was often necessary for survival. As for their ghostly appearances at the swamp's edge, Whittaker proposed these were deliberate acts of psychological warfare against their former oppressors. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of Whittaker's research was his discovery that disappearances and sightings followed a pattern corresponding to attempts to develop or encroach upon the swampland. In periods when neighboring properties respected the swamp's boundary, incidents were rare. When development was attempted, sightings and disappearances increased dramatically. The final documented sighting of the twins came in August 1860, a decade after their escape. A land surveying party working for a railroad company considering a route through the region reported encountering two identical men of approximately 35 years of age, dressed in clothing made from natural materials, standing in the center of the path, about half a mile into the swampland. According to the surveyor's report, preserved in railroad company records, the men made no sound, but gestured in a way that clearly indicated we should retreat. When our guide attempted to continue forward, the pair made a motion toward the water, at which point the guide observed something that caused him to back away immediately. He refused to elaborate on what he had seen, but insisted we leave the area at once. Upon our departure, we observed the two men watching until we were out of sight. The railroad ultimately chose a different route. The Civil War and subsequent societal changes shifted attention away from the legend of the Swamp Twins. The former Tillman Plantation lands were further subdivided, and many individuals with direct knowledge of the events died or moved away. By the 1880s, the story had largely transformed from recent history into local folklore. In 1959, a doctoral student in anthropology at the University of South Carolina, named Margaret Hollis, became interested in the legend while researching communities of escaped enslaved people in the South. Hollis spent 3 years collecting oral histories from descendants of people who had lived in the area during the 1850s. Her dissertation, completed in 1962 but never published, contains transcripts of these interviews, including several from elderly individuals who claimed their grandparents or great-grandparents had been among those who escaped to join the swamp community. According to these accounts, the twins, whose actual names were not Solomon and Samuel, but Adopo and Quame, reflecting their West African heritage, had indeed established a settlement deep within the Congaree swamp. The community supposedly survived for decades, gradually integrating with other marginalized groups in the area after the Civil War. What made Hollis's research particularly controversial was her claim, based on these oral histories, that the twins had set up a complex system of governance founded on consensus rather than hierarchy, and that their apparently supernatural abilities were actually the result of an elaborate system of signals and environmental knowledge. Hollis tried to locate the settlement site based on descriptions from these oral histories, but the constantly changing nature of the swamp environment made this impossible. In her field notes from June 1961, she wrote, "Local guides remain reluctant to venture deeply into certain areas of the swamp, particularly as evening approaches. When pressed, they simply say that some places still belong to the twins and their people." Even after all these years, the most tantalizing piece of evidence uncovered by Hollis came in the form of a photograph taken in 1891, discovered in the personal collection of a family that had owned property neighboring the former Tillman Plantation. The photograph shows a group of men standing in front of a rural church. At the edge of the group are two elderly black men who appear identical, their posture straight despite their apparent age, their expressions unreadable. The notation on the back identifies the church, but not the individuals pictured. Hollis's dissertation advisor ultimately advised her to focus on more verifiable aspects of maroon communities in the South, and her research into the twins was relegated to an appendix. Shortly after completing her dissertation, Hollis accepted a teaching position at a university in California and never returned to the research. Her papers, including her field notes and copies of the photograph, were donated to the University of South Carolina archives after her death in 1968. Today, the Congaree Swamp is part of a national park. Rangers occasionally report that visitors ask about the twin ghosts, though the story has largely faded from popular knowledge. What remains is a protected wilderness that continues to guard its secrets. And perhaps, somewhere deep within, the legacy of two brothers who refused to be property and created something that to those who had enslaved them seemed impossible, a place of freedom. The true horror of this story lies not in supernatural elements, but in the very real system that treated human beings as property, that separated families, that answered the quest for freedom with violence. It lies in the knowledge that for every documented case, like that of the twins, there were thousands of others whose names and stories were systematically erased from history. The sounds that travelers sometimes report hearing in the Congaree as dusk approaches. Voices calling in unison, then falling silent when approached, are attributed to birds or the wind moving through the cypress trees. Rangers assure visitors that the trails are safe and well maintained, but some local guides still refuse to enter certain areas as the light begins to fade. When asked why, they often give practical reasons. Difficulty navigating in low light, the presence of wildlife that becomes more active at dusk. Only rarely will someone admit the real reason, a persistent belief that some parts of the swamp still belong to those who claimed it as their own, who transformed a place of exile into a place of freedom, and who still stand watch at the boundary between their world and ours. In 1966, a historian researching disappeared settlements in the region reported a strange experience while camping near the former boundary of the Tillman Plantation. In his field notes, he wrote, "As dusk fell, I observed what appeared to be two figures standing at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still and seemingly identical. When I called out, they retreated into the tree line. I followed but found no trace. What struck me most was not fear, but a profound sense that I was the intruder, that I had ventured uninvited into a place where others had rightful claim. I packed my equipment that night and left at first light." Some histories, perhaps, are not meant to be documented by those who inherit the legacy of the oppressors. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the story of the twins comes from a poem written by an anonymous author in 1870, discovered in a collection of local folklore compiled by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s. Two brothers born as one, divided by force but never truly parted, found in water and darkness what was denied in light and land. They speak now without voices, watch without being seen, standing guard at the border between what was taken and what was claimed. Listen at dusk for their silence. It says more than our histories ever could. The research into the twins' legacy took an unexpected turn in 1963 when a hydrological survey of the Congaree Swamp revealed unusual patterns in the water flow that suggested artificial modifications to the natural environment. According to the survey report, filed with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, certain channels appear to have been deliberately altered to create areas of habitable dry land, where none should naturally exist. These modifications show considerable ingenuity and an intimate understanding of swamp hydrology. Most striking is the fact that these alterations appear to have been maintained over time, suggesting continuous human intervention spanning decades. This discovery prompted a small archaeological expedition in the spring of 1964, led by Dr. Robert Thornton from the University of North Carolina. The expedition's stated purpose was to document evidence of historical habitation within the swamp, with a particular focus on potential maroon communities. settlements of escaped, enslaved people who created independent societies in remote areas. According to the expedition's official report, preserved in the university archives, evidence of long-term human habitation was discovered approximately 3 miles into the swampland from the former Tillman property line. Artifacts recovered include modified tools, pottery fragments consistent with 19th century manufacture, but showing unique adaptations to the swamp environment, and the remnants of what appear to be elevated structural supports. The most significant find, however, came when the team began excavating what appeared to be a midden, a historical trash deposit. Among the discarded items were several personal effects that could be directly linked to the Tillman plantation, including a pocket watch with the initials JT engraved on the case, consistent with Jacob Tillman's ancestor. More disturbing was the discovery of what Dr. Thornton described as human remains, showing evidence of deliberate interment according to what appears to be a specific ritual pattern. The remains of 6 individuals were uncovered, all adult males, positioned in a circular arrangement around a central point. Further analysis of these remains conducted at the university laboratory indicated that all 6 had died of different causes, but all had been subjected to post-mortem practices that the report described only as consistent with certain West African customs designed to prevent the spirit's return. The report noted that 3 of the individuals showed evidence of having been plantation owners or overseers based on clothing fragments and personal items. Personal items buried with them, according to notes in Dr. Thornton's field journal, which were not included in the official report, but were later found among his personal papers after his death in 1967. The arrangement of these burials suggests not merely disposal of bodies, but a deliberate ritual meant to establish boundaries. Local folklore specialists have suggested this pattern is consistent with traditional practices intended to create a spiritual barrier around a protected area. What's most unsettling is the evidence that these rituals continued well into the 1880s, long after the initial escape of the twins and the disappearance of Jacob Tillman. The expedition was scheduled to continue for another week, venturing deeper into the swamp toward what satellite imagery suggested might be the main settlement area. However, on April 27, 1964, a severe storm hit the region, flooding much of the swamp and forcing the team to evacuate. According to Dr. Thornton's records, during the evacuation, 2 team members became briefly separated from the main group. When they rejoined the others, they reported having seen 2 elderly men, identical in appearance, observing us from an elevated platform approximately 50 yards away. By the time the rest of the team looked in that direction, there was no one visible. The planned return to the site never materialized. University records indicate that funding for the project was unexpectedly cut the following month, with a note from the department chair stating that the academic value of the project does not justify the considerable risks involved in conducting research in such a hazardous environment. Dr. Thornton's subsequent appeals for renewed funding were denied, and he eventually shifted his research focus to coastal archaeological sites. However, in a private letter to a colleague dated December 18, 1965, Thornton wrote, "The real reason for the termination of the Congaree project had nothing to do with academic value or physical risk. Shortly after our return, I was visited by 2 representatives from a federal agency who expressed national security concerns about our findings. They were particularly interested in our photographic documentation of the modified waterways and structural foundations. All our materials were confiscated under the pretense of historical preservation, though I was assured copies would be returned to me. They never were. When I inquired further, I was informed that the area we had been investigating was now restricted for environmental conservation purposes. The more I consider what we found, and what we might have found had we continued, the more I'm convinced that there is something in that swamp that certain powers do not want documented. In 1966, an article appeared in a small local newspaper serving the communities around the Congaree region. The article, written by a junior reporter named Michael Denton, described a pattern of unusual occurrences in the areas bordering the swamp. According to Denton's investigation, there had been 17 incidents over the previous decade in which individuals attempting to conduct unauthorized development or resource extraction in protected areas of the swamp had experienced what he termed targeted misfortunes. These range from equipment failures to personal accidents, with all affected individuals reporting having seen two identical figures watching from a distance shortly before the incidents occurred. Most telling was Denton's interview with a former ranger from the recently established Congaree Wildlife Conservation Area, who spoke on condition of anonymity. There are parts of that swamp we're instructed not to patrol, especially after about 4 in the afternoon. The official reason is dangerous terrain, but everyone knows the real story. Something's out there that doesn't want to be found, and the higher-ups have made the decision to respect that wish. I've seen them myself. 2 men, always together, always watching. They never approach, never threaten. They just make their presence known when you're getting close to somewhere you shouldn't be. Denton's article might have reached a wider audience had the newspaper not abruptly closed the following month due to financial difficulties. Denton himself moved to Atlanta to pursue other journalistic opportunities, though colleagues noted his reluctance to discuss his final story from his time at the local paper. In 1968, during construction of a new highway that would pass within a mile of the former Tillman Plantation land, workers reported a series of unusual equipment malfunctions. According to incident reports filed with the construction company, these malfunctions occurred primarily in the late afternoon and affected only the equipment being used closest to the swamp boundary. Multiple workers resigned over the course of the project, citing unsettling experiences that most refused to elaborate on. One worker, however, provided a detailed statement to his supervisor that was included in the project records. We were finishing up for the day around 5:30 in the afternoon when I noticed 2 men standing at the edge of the clearing. They looked identical, same height, same build, same clothing. What struck me was how still they were. When I pointed them out to my coworker, he said we should pack up immediately. As we were loading our equipment, I kept glancing over at them. They never moved, just watched us. The next day, we found our excavator partially submerged in a sinkhole that hadn't been there the evening before. The project manager decided to shift the highway route another 3/4 of a mile east after that. The highway was eventually completed in 1969, though records indicate that the final route diverged significantly from the original plan, adding considerable cost to the project. The official explanation cited unstable ground conditions as the reason for the change. Throughout the 1970s, as environmental protection became a greater national priority, the Congaree Swamp received increasing attention from conservation groups. Their efforts led to its designation as a national monument in 1976, protecting it from further development. What's notable in the congressional testimony supporting this designation is the absence of any mention of the historical human habitation of the area. The swamp was presented solely as a pristine natural environment, with no acknowledgement of its role as a refuge for escaped enslaved people or the community that oral history suggested had thrived there for decades. This omission did not go unnoticed by everyone. Dr. Elaine Johnson, a historian specializing in African American communities during the post-Civil War era, began researching the Congaree settlements in 1979. In her grant application to the National Endowment for the Humanities, she wrote, "There appears to be a systematic erasure of the human history of the Congaree Swamp, particularly as it relates to the community of formerly enslaved individuals who created an independent society there. This erasure serves to perpetuate the myth that such successful resistance to the slave system was impossible, when in fact we have substantial evidence that it not only occurred, but thrived for generations." Johnson's grant was approved, but her research faced constant obstacles. In her project notes from March 1980, she wrote, "Local informants who had previously expressed willingness to share family stories suddenly become reluctant when I arrived for scheduled interviews. Archives that had confirmed the availability of certain documents now claim they cannot be located. Most disturbing is the repeated warning I receive, always delivered obliquely, that some histories are better left unexplored." Despite these challenges, Johnson managed to compile significant evidence supporting the existence of what she termed the Swamp Nation, a self-governing community that had existed within the Congaree from approximately 1850 to the early 1900s. Her most compelling findings came from census records from 1870 and 1880, which showed unusual patterns in the reported population of certain rural areas bordering the swamp. According to her analysis, there is a statistical anomaly in which households on the swamp border report taking in distant relatives or elderly companions at a rate far exceeding the regional average. When these individuals are tracked through subsequent records, they often have no clear origin, but are frequently described as formerly from the South Carolina interior, a vague designation that could well indicate the swamp communities. Johnson also uncovered evidence that the twins had not merely survived, but had become influential figures in the broader community. In church records from a small black congregation established in 1868 near the edge of the swamp, there are multiple references to the brothers who speak as one, who would occasionally attend services, but more often sent representatives from the interior settlement. These records include a notation from the pastor dated 1873. "The brothers attended today for the wedding of young Sarah. As always, they spoke not a word during the service, but communicated their blessing in their own way. The bride seemed especially honored by their presence, as they rarely venture this far from their domain. They have aged visibly since last I saw them, yet they move with the same quiet strength. One cannot help but feel that they carry with them the very spirit of liberation that our people still strive toward." Johnson's research was never formally published. According to colleagues, she intended to compile her findings into a book, but the manuscript remained unfinished at the time of her death in 1984. The circumstances of her death, a single vehicle accident on a rural road near the Congaree, raised questions among some who knew her work. According to the police report, Johnson's car veered off the road and into a drainage ditch approximately 2 miles from the entrance to what was then the Congaree National Monument. The accident occurred at dusk, and there were no witnesses. Johnson's research materials, which should have been extensive, were never recovered. Her university office was found meticulously organized, but empty of any notes or documentation related to the Congaree project. Her home similarly contained no relevant materials. A colleague who had been working closely with Johnson told a local reporter that just a week before her death, Johnson had mentioned making breakthrough discovery that would change our understanding of how resistance to slavery could succeed. The nature of that discovery remains unknown. In 1989, during an unusually severe drought that caused water levels in the Congaree to drop significantly, a group of hikers ventured off the marked trails and discovered what appeared to be the remains of an elevated structure deep within the swamp. According to their report to park rangers, "We found wooden posts extending from the dried mud, arranged in a pattern that clearly indicated human construction. What was most interesting was that these posts showed tool marks consistent with 19th century methods. Yet the wood itself was remarkably preserved, suggesting some form of treatment that protected it from normal decay. Park officials investigated the site, but downplayed its significance, describing it as likely a hunter's blind or temporary shelter of relatively recent origin. No formal archaeological assessment was conducted,